Welcome back to another episode of the Still Curtain Podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi. Joining me is co-host Shayne Kubas. We are coming off back-to-back wins for the Pittsburgh Steelers for the first time since the end of the 2021 season. I got to admit, it feels good, even though I'm not really sure what we should be rooting for at this point. Technically, Steelers aren't out of the playoff hunt just yet. They're a couple games back. If one or two of those other games would have gone just a little bit differently, the Browns game, Patriots, Jets, we could be looking at a different scenario right now. But as it is, the Steelers really need to win out. Maybe they can afford one loss along the way. We're going to recap this matchup against the Falcons that just played out on Sunday and talk about the Ravens game coming up here. So let's talk about this Falcons game for a minute, Shayne. It was much of the same as what we saw against the Colts in the week prior. And whereas like the offense started off hot, Kenny Pickett was having a great first half. And then all of a sudden things died down there quite a bit to the point where the Steelers scored just 3 points in the second half against the Falcons. They allowed them to claw their way back into the game. It ended up being a 19-16 game. It never really felt that close to me, but I feel like with Matt Canada, with this Steelers offense, they can't just stick it to a team. Like it's always got to be close if they do end up winning.
Yeah, I think the thing that's really interesting is for the most part, for the first half of the season, we couldn't get anything going offensively, period, right? It wasn't just like a second half collapse thing. It wasn't a first half struggle thing. It was just struggle across the board, right? And now it feels like Canada has figured out how to game plan for the first half of a game. And Pickett has obviously improved himself, which has made it a little bit easier as well. He's making some plays that he hadn't been making up to this point. But then in the second half, they don't really change anything, or they just go lean on the run game even harder than they have been, and it doesn't get it done. And they kind of take the ball out of Pickett's hands, and you see what's happened the past, really 3 weeks. They're averaging, I think it is at this point, I think it's like 6 points or something like that per game in the second half, the last 3 games. Like it's just not good enough. And even with the defense, healthy and playing better, you can't keep asking them to hold these leads, especially when they're not big leads going into the second half.
Yeah, I was really frustrated to see that game plan shift a little bit there because that's what we've seen really since the bye week. Because I think that Steelers, they start off pretty strong. And then by the second half of the game, over the last 3 games, the Steelers have scored a combined 20 points. And so that's 6 quarters of play, 20 points. That's not good. It's not what you want. The Steelers in their first drive in the second half against the Falcons, they scored a field goal. It was all punts after that. And it's just not ideal. You want to be able to see them finish for that full 30 minutes in the second half as well. And so we're not used to seeing that this year. It hasn't really happened yet where they've kicked it into gear in the second half. Shayne, let's talk about our winners and losers from that game. Who did you have standing out in this one?
So I think for me, both Kenny Pickett and Harris had 2 of their best. So Najee Harris had 2 of their best games of the year, in my opinion. Pickett finally hit that 7 yards per attempt barrier. Granted, he didn't have as many attempts because they kind of took the ball out of his hands in the second half. And he was helped by, pretty big Freiermuth catch and run in the first half as well. But in general, I think he played a really solid game. He had a couple struggles early completing passes, but once he got settled down, played pretty well. Najee, we didn't know if he'd even play this week early in the week, and then he says he's good to go, and he showed it. And averaging 5.1 yards per carry, being the engine of the run game. So that was really nice to see. And then got to mention Minka, kind of icing the game at the end with that pick. I think he should have personally scored because I know that with the Jets thing that happened earlier in the season with the Browns, they don't want to see that. But pretty confident, we would have been fine if he would have done that. But I'll still take the game sealing pick, obviously. I think those 3 guys stood out probably the most for me overall, with Pat making that one big play too. So.
Yeah, I know that fans wanted to see him punch it in, dive, make a play for the pylon right there, and I think he could have too. Like he had the angle,
he would have scored. I think so,
chased down by an offensive lineman, so stepping out like 4 yards short or whatever. It's like I mean, we knew that the Steelers were going to win at that point. All they got to do is kneel on the clock, but it would have made it a 2-score game anyway. It would have been the same result anyway. But yeah, excellent game from Minka. Like this guy is playing lights out. And to be quite honest, I think that this is his most impressive season of his career, even with his other 2 all-pro seasons. And I think a lot of the reason why is because he's been missing TJ Watt for most of the year. He's grading out as the number 1 safety regardless. And the Steelers can't generate pressure this season either, especially when in that long stretch when Watt was out. And so for Minka to be playing as well as he has, very impressive. Again, he's on pace for just another all-pro season, kind of back on his Hall of Fame track here, if you will. I mean, early in his career. So if he gets 3 first-team all-pros, he's well on his way. I want to highlight another name here that we seldom talk about. It's Connor Hayward. I think that Hayward came up with the big touchdown catch there. I can see him being like involved a little bit more heavily in the offense.
I hope so. Yeah.
I think they like to move him around, and I think he's got really good hands. And so it's hard to know exactly what to do with a 5'11" guy that runs in the 4.7s and is kind of stuck in between positions. But I do think he's a very natural football player, and he'll be able to use in those type of roles. And again, you briefly mentioned Pat Freiermuth. Man, that guy is just a beast. It's hard not to want to throw to him every play because he just seems to snatch everything that you put up in his catch radius. And not only that, but he's become a monster after catch too. Like he's a guy that's tough to bring down. And so, I mean, I think I want to do one of these shows. We can kind of go through and rank some of these Steeler players and where they fit, like in compared to in like rankings across the NFL and players at their position. He's climbing the ladder. Like, I mean, I think that you can make the case right now that it's like Travis Kelce in tier of his own. And then I think you got to consider Freiermuth right in that next tier, right below him with like Dallas Goedert and a few of those other guys. George Kittle, he's right there. I mean, he's a guy that's certainly emerging, and he's becoming a very efficient option to go to in the passing game for Pickett. Certainly becoming a favorite option of his as well. All right. Shane, give us your losers for this game. I know we have a couple of those. It's a loss, but it wasn't, or I'm sorry, it's a win, but it wasn't a pretty win for the Steelers.
No, I think the run defense in the second half, once the Falcons committed to running the ball, they didn't do much in the first half. They kind of were trying to pass their way out of that deficit. But once they started leaning on the run game, they started getting drives going, and Patterson was just impossible to tackle, it felt like, for them at times. Algier was really good. So the run defense overall in the second half needs to, pick it up there for sure. George Pickens, there's a lot of conversation around him this week, and I understand why. I watched the game back again. He didn't really get open by most receiver standards, but again, he's not a guy that really you care that much how open he is. It's more so throwing him open. So I understand why he's frustrated, but again, the game plan just didn't go his way this week, and you want to see him kind of hopefully handle that a little bit better down the road. And then even though he was the second leading receiver, Deontay Johnson's just not been efficient with his routes and with his receptions. And a lot of it's not his fault. It is part of the game plan, the way he's being used. But again, for a guy getting so many targets, like, you want to see more production and more efficiency out of him. And he looked better when he did get his opportunities to catch the ball. He did have, a couple of plays where he didn't just run around backwards like he tends to do. But again, you just want to see more production out of him, I think, for sure.
Yeah, I think Deontay is my biggest one, honestly. Yeah. He had that huge third down drop that would have been he would have moved the chains on that one right there. I probably would have resulted in a touchdown, not guaranteed. But then he had the other one where he didn't tuck the ball away and he's carrying it out there. That probably should have remained a fumble. Like, it was close enough that I didn't think that they would overturn that. And that could have been a game-changing play right there too. Atlanta could have been ready to score. And so, I mean, 60 yards on 11 targets is just not good enough. And I know that some of it obviously falls on Matt Canada and how he's being used, but when you're getting as many looks as you're getting, you have to be more efficient. He's 8th in the NFL in targets. He's got 105 targets in the season. He's the only wide receiver in the NFL with under 750 yards who has 100 targets. He's also I'm trying to think that other stat. I just posted out there on Twitter now.
Yeah, I know.
I'm drawing a blank on it. Yeah. But yeah, it was, I mean, in terms of efficiency, he's right near the bottom of the NFL among starting receivers right now, and that's a little bit scary.
Yeah, I think that the one that you were thinking of is he's the only guy with 50 plus targets or catches, or one of the two that doesn't have a touchdown either.
That's the other one. Yes.
Yeah. Which again, he's had chances to score recently too, and just hasn't happened too, which that makes it worse. But I think, like you said, like, it just, for me, and the thing I've been thinking about recently, and like, obviously they're two very different players skill set wise, and like, I understand, especially at the time that we did it, why. But like, if you're going to use him the way that you've used him, and you're going to ask him to run the routes he's running, and he's going to play this way, we probably should have just paid Juju a little bit of money to just come back and not pay Deontay.
Yeah.
And if you're going to use them in the same way, because he wasn't efficient for us either last year, Juju, past couple of years. He can do the stuff that they're asking Deontay to do realistically, and you wouldn't have had to pay him, a lot of money. And that sucks, because I think Deontay is the better player whenever it's like in a vacuum. But right now he's not playing like it. And you've seen what Juju's done for, granted, Kansas City, different offense, but it just feels like it was money that might not be well spent, partly because of him and partly because of how we're using him.
Yeah, and I think that's the part, again, that makes it so disheartening, is paying the guy over $18 million a year and not getting the production that you desire at all out of him, or the efficiency. And so we obviously hope that those numbers go up. I want to point to the defensive line as well, because they were just manhandled completely in the second half. And fortunately, the Steelers already had a comfortable lead at that point, and so it didn't change the final result of the game. But this defensive line just looks so sad anymore, like outside of Cameron Hayward. And I was just looking back. It wasn't that long ago where the Steelers had Hayward. They had Stephon Tuitt in his prime. They had Javon Hargrave in his prime. And so they were strong. Like they were potentially the strongest interior defensive line in the NFL. And boy, how they have fallen. And I'm hoping that like DeMarvin Leal becomes a guy that they can count on here in the future. But outside of Hayward, and then the upside of Leal, there's really nobody that you can point to and say, this is a guy that should be here next year or the year beyond, or should be a difference maker of any kind, because it's hard to see that out of any of these other guys they have, Ogunjobi included. And that guy is probably going to end up signing elsewhere next year, I would imagine too, but we'll see. So that's a little bit disheartening. And for the first time ever, I've got to point to, it's not all his fault, but I'm going to say TJ Watt. And just because he really wasn't that dominating X factor that we've been so used to seeing over the years. But again, you can tell when TJ Watt is healthy, and you can tell when TJ Watt is not healthy. I do not believe that he's healthy right now.
Not fully. No.
I mean, he's like wincing going off the field. He's taking a knee when he gets to the sideline. This guy's got his ribs are hurting him. I don't know if there's anything else bothering him. Tomlin kind of alluded that to in his post-game press conference as well, that TJ Watt is banged up right now. And man, you kind of like to see, if the Steelers could afford to, just sit him for another game or two. Let the guy get back to full strength, and so that he can really get after the quarterback, because we've not seen the same TJ Watt these last couple of games that we've been used to seeing. And I know that the guy just needs to get back to strength. And once he does, I mean, he's a force to be reckoned with. So I think those are our losers for this week. Shane, where do Steelers need to improve the most? I mean, this week got a couple wins here, but to string together that third, what do they got to do?
I think the run discipline, right? Like we talked about, the running game has been definitely something that teams been able to use against us more frequently recently. Did overall a pretty good job against the Colts, but again, like the Falcons just kind of ran away with it almost at the second half, legitimately. Pass rush, like you already mentioned, needs to play a little bit better. TJ definitely needs to just get healthy, like you said. Even 70% of TJ Watt is better than anyone else who could possibly throw out there, but only at that percentage doesn't bring the same impact that he would normally. And it's not impacting the other guys and allowing them to do what they need to do. So that needs to get better. Explosive plays in the passing game, outside of Pat's catch and run situation he had where he broke like a million tackles and ran down the sideline, we didn't really have a lot of attempts down the field or opportunities to throw down the field. So that needs to continue to get better. And then you have to get Pickens involved consistently, because we see, like, obviously you don't want him to act out the way he did, but you got to keep him happy and motivated to play. And if you do that, I think he's going to continue to take his ascent that he was starting earlier in the year.
Yeah, I think you hit all those on the head, Shane. But the one that I would add as well is, I think the target distribution needs to shift a little bit. I really do. I don't think it's reasonable at this point. And it made sense the last 2 years why Ben did it. Right. He had that chemistry with Johnson. Johnson owned a heavy market share in Pittsburgh. I think that we need to see a paradigm shift there. I think Freiermuth needs to get more targets, and he's been getting a comfortable amount. But Pickens is the one that's been so up and down, and not just to appease Pickens. I think they need to do it because Pickens is probably the better player already at this point than Johnson. And he's certainly, in terms of efficiency, certainly more efficient when throwing the ball. Steelers quarterbacks this year, they have a 98.5 passer rating when targeting George Pickens. They have a 53.1 pass rating when targeting Deontay Johnson. Again, it's not all Johnson's fault. It's a lot of it is about how he's being used in the route tree that he's had this year compared to years past. But I do think that we need to see that change, a healthy change, because we shouldn't have games where Johnson's getting 11 targets and Pickens is getting 2, and one of those is uncatchable and the other one's engineered. Like we need to see more. And I think that part of that needs to start with Pickett as well, and taking some more chances down the sideline. He had situations in cover one where Pickens was the guy that was singled down the field, and he took the shot at Johnson instead. And those are the ones I'd like to see that shift. I mean, 30 or 6'3" guy that pretty much comes down with everything. And so that is one where I will say the Steelers need to improve on. Shane, give me your player of the game versus Falcons.
I think you got to go Minka. And he led the team in tackles, solo tackles. He had a tackle for loss in the run game. He had the game-stealing pick. Like, again, he is right now, especially with TJ still not 100%, clearly the best player on this football team overall. And that's probably not going to change, like, again, until TJ is fully healthy or, whatever may happen there. But the offense is good enough right now, and they did enough in this game. But none of those guys, I think, are the impact that Minka is right now, especially with how he ended the game.
Yeah, it's so hard not to say Minka as well for this one. So I'll say Minka. If I were to give it an honorable mention, though, I think the offensive line, is in particular the interior offensive line, I think that those guys have been protecting very well as of late. Like since the bye week, I think good enough to the point where you can say, yeah, interior offensive line, it might not be a big need for us at all. In fact, James Daniels is turning out to be quite a good player for the Steelers. Kevin Dotson's been more consistent since the bye week. He hasn't been perfect, but you can definitely see some signs there. And considering that Dotson's getting paid a lot less than other guards that are probably his quality around the NFL, that's something to consider. I still think the tackles need work, and I do think that Dan Moore is going to need to be replaced. But overall, I mean, the job that the offensive line is doing, and I props to Najee too for running so hard these last couple of weeks. He's broken a lot of tackles, and I'm not taking anything away from him at all. But when you have Najee running well and Benny Snell running well, who has historically averaged under 3.5 yards a carry, Anthony McFarland got his touches in the other week, and so you can see the progress that this group is making. I think a lot of it has to do with health too. They've been probably the healthiest offensive line in the NFL. Guys have only missed a number of snaps at a time. Nobody's missed full games. So that definitely helps. So good to see them progressing in the right direction. All right, let's continue talking about that Steelers rushing attack here. It's come alive so much as of late that since the bye week, the Steelers are averaging 161 rushing yards a game. That's good for 5th in the NFL. And they're kind of being able to impose their will on people here. And again, it's come from a collection of players. It's not just Najee. Najee is playing, I think, probably the best football of his career so far since the bye. And you could have argued that before the bye, it was the worst football that he's played. And so good to see that turnaround from him. What do you think the reason is for this change, Shane? Is there anything in particular that stands out to you?
I think it's a combination of things, right? And most times when you see this big of a paradigm shift from one extreme to the other, where we're one of the worst rushing teams and all of a sudden we're maybe the best rushing team over the past few weeks, the run blocking definitely is better. The offensive line is gelling better as a run game unit, at least. The tackles are still struggling in the pass game, but overall, run game really hasn't been an issue from a blocking standpoint since the bye. And Najee's healthy. Even with the injury last week, like you could tell he's healthier than he's been all year. The backup running backs are getting the job done when they're asked to carry the ball. Kenny Pickett's contributing as a runner from the quarterback position. Like everybody is adding on to the rushing total, whether it's receivers, on the jet sweeps, all that stuff is all contributing to it. And you can tell that it's been a point of emphasis, right? Because they had to find an identity. This team did not have an identity offensively before the bye, and they clearly have one now, and I think that is what the biggest, reason for it is, just the focus put on it, right? When you're a team that doesn't do anything well, you have to find something that you can lean on. And for the Steelers this year, clearly it's going to be the run game probably through the end of this season, regardless of how well Pickett maybe plays down the stretch.
Yeah, and I don't want to be this guy either, but I do think that strength of schedule is probably a leading factor in there as well. When you're playing teams like the Saints and the Falcons, Colts had a good defense, but their linebacker play just has not been very good. And so I do think that attributes to that. And so it'll be interesting. I think this next game is going to be a great test for them against the Baltimore Ravens, their defensive line. And so if they can continue doing what they've been doing, that 160 yards, even if they go over 100 yards and 4.5 yards a carry with a good run success rate, I mean, that's what we're looking for. And so I think that it will continue. So let me ask you this, Shane. Do you think that it's going to continue? And why do you think that's going to continue?
I think it can continue, maybe not to the same volume, just because I think we're going to be in games a little bit closer down the stretch than we've been the last few weeks. So the attempts might not be as many, right? But I think the efficiency certainly can remain the same because you can tell with this run blocking, like they can get enough push right now to allow there to be a lane to go through, and all these running backs are either breaking tackles or getting through the line quickly. A combination of different things in their skill sets are giving them the opportunity to hit that 3, 4, 5 yards per touch mark, which that's what you want to get to if you're going to be successful running the ball. You want to stay ahead of the change. And we know Matt Canada loves nothing but to get in the 3rd and 2, right? Like he's always trying to get the 3rd and 2. So if you can get those 4 or 5 yards of carry, like you said, that's really all that matters. Like if you can consistently do that, then this should be able to continue even against teams that might be a little bit harder to run on.
Yeah, and we talk about the Baltimore Ravens. They allow just 3.8 yards of carry, and that's good for 3rd in the NFL. I think that, again, is going to be the true test. If they can do it this week, I don't think there's any reason to believe that the Steelers won't do it for the rest of the season because they've come that far. I mean, barring any injuries, I think that the chemistry has grown between these linemen. But there's a couple of those runs that I noticed when I was cutting up the film from the Falcons game. Man, they had everything sealed off perfectly to a T. Around the one run in particular where Najee Harris bounced it off left tackle, George Pickens picked up his guy, and there was just wide open space for days. And so that's what you love to see. It's this line starting to improve and to be able to handle the guys in front of them. And so, I mean, you're always going to be able to keep you in the games. The running game doesn't necessarily translate to points very well, but it keeps the chains moving. It controls the clock. It helps keep your guys fresh, your defensive guys fresh on the sidelines. And so we've seen how that successful running game has translated to success for the Steelers since the bye week. They're 3-1. And I think a lot of that has to do with their run game and how successful they've been there. I do have one issue with the rushing attack so far. And I don't want to make a big stink over it because if it's not broke, don't fix it. But the Steelers have an incredibly poor explosive run play rate. And I think that where that matters is in the upside of their offense and their ability to score from not just from within the red zone, but outside of the red zone. This team, and it's been happening for a long time because Le'Veon Bell didn't do it either. He just wasn't that guy. But this team cannot break explosive run plays. They cannot break big, get in the open field and break off big runs for touchdowns. And so if we look at, I broke this down this week, and this is a little bit discouraging. On 330 carries, and this is everybody in the Pittsburgh Steelers this year, on 330 carries, the Steelers have 4 runs of over 20 yards. And it's the worst rate in the NFL, and it's just not what you want to see at all. If you break it down a little bit further, 238 of their carries have come from running backs, not wide receiver end rounds or quarterbacks. And of those 238 carries from running backs, they only have 2 rushes of over 20 yards, which is an explosive play rate of, I believe, 0.8%. It's very, very poor. Break it down one step further. And again, I'm not trying to harp on the guy. It's just, it's part of his running style, and he's still been good. But Najee Harris this year has 175 carries. He only has attributed 1 of those 20-yard plays, which is an explosive play rate of 0.57%. And it's extremely low. It's not what you want to see. And when you compare this to teams like, let's say, the Dallas Cowboys with Ezekiel Elliott, Tony Pollard, their explosive play rate is 5 times higher than the Steelers. It's probably why they're scoring so many points per game. They have 19 rushing touchdowns this year. And so when you've got a guy with speed, like a Tony Pollard, you can take that ball to the house from any distance as long as you have the crease in the blocking there. And we've seen that from him multiple times this year. The Steelers just don't have a back on the roster that's capable of doing that. When McFarland is not activated, and he's typically not, he was bumped back down to the practice squad, then I think your fastest guy at that point is Jaylen Warren. And the problem is Jaylen Warren still only runs a 4.54. And so he's not any faster than your average linebacker that you're going against. And he's only attributed 1 of those 20-yard plays. And so I think the Steelers need to get more explosive. I'm thrilled with the success that they've had since the bye week. Don't get me wrong. But I think you can go from being a very good rushing team to an elite rushing team if you had that speed element. Najee is never going to have it, and that's all right. But they probably do need to draft a back at some point. If it's not going to be McFarland, and it probably won't be at this point, they probably do need to get that guy at some point, their version of a Tony Pollard or a Travis Etienne, that guy that can bust out those huge chunk plays and take advantage of that, because that is when rushing success will truly translate to points and not just be something that takes time off the clock and moves the chains.
I think for me overall, like I do understand that point, because you do want to have explosive plays anytime you can get them. But if the rushing success is there from an effectiveness standpoint, it doesn't bother me as much as when the passing game doesn't have the explosive plays. Because I think if you had to choose one, I'm definitely taking the explosive plays in the passing game, because it's more valuable. You don't have to. There's more concern when you put the ball up 40 times in the air to get 300 yards, right? If you don't have to do that, if you can take selective chances and not have to nickel and dime teams, there's less things that can go wrong, right? So I would definitely want to see the Steelers get more explosive plays, but I'm definitely looking at the passing game for that at this point, because one, the potential is way more, there than it is with the run game, as you alluded to. But I do want to see this team add a speed element in the backfield. I know that that's something that I'm sure that they're interested in doing. I think it just didn't really work out this past offseason. But if they can add a guy who maybe only gets a few carries a game, but has potential to break something off, and you can use him in that role, that would definitely add value to the offense for sure.
Yeah, and again, just being nitpicky, because like I said, since the bye week, Steelers have been excellent on the ground. Can't complain there, really. And I agree with you. I do want to see him get more explosive in the passing game. If Kenny Pickett can go from 6.5 yards attempt to 7.5 yards attempt, that's going to make a much bigger difference. And it's something that really needs to happen at some point. And I was hoping to see that. And that's why, again, these last couple of games kind of discouraging, because all right, the first half, Kenny Pickett's averaging nearly 8 yards an attempt against the Colts and against the Falcons. And then we just see that number plummet in the second half because of, I think a lot of it has to do with the game plan. And then there's been some really big second half drops too that have not helped him in that area as well. And so I want to see that play out for a full game. We'll see if Pickett and Canada are capable of coming together and making that happen, or if the Steelers have a lead, if they're always just going to play that conservative ball and say, hey, we don't want to put our rookie situation or quarterback in any situation that could potentially lose him the game and hurt his confidence, whatever else. The results, the Steelers have been coming away with the wins, but I want to see it be because of Kenny Pickett. I want to see him be that guy for a full 4 quarters. And I think Canada has to let him do that at some point. All right. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and would like to support the Still Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all your support. Shane, let's talk about the Steelers matchup against the Ravens. I didn't think a few weeks back that this game would have as big of implications as it has right now. And to think the Ravens are coming off of a 10-9 win against the Denver Broncos, this bottom-dwelling team. So Baltimore nearly lost this game. And so instead of being 8-4 right now, we would be looking at a 7-5 Ravens team. And so mathematically, the Steelers could flip that entirely with 2 wins against the Ravens down the stretch. That could have been really big, especially for the Ravens, who currently sit atop the AFC North. And so something interesting to think about there. As it turns out, they did win that game against the Broncos. Nothing we can do about that now, but the Steelers can kind of control their own destiny from here on out. If they win out, there's a very good chance that they're in the playoffs. If they lose one game, there's still a chance that they make the playoffs at 9-8 by the end of the season. They're right there in that hunt still, believe it or not, after fighting back. And so they need this game, though. They need this game at home.
I think for me, the most interesting part about this, and you alluded to it, is that if they lose that game, things are very different for the Steelers, because we can overtake them, especially if Lamar doesn't play the rest of the year, which I think is very possible. I think he might look at this team and see how bad they were offensively, skill position-wise, and say, you know what? I'm going to rest on my laurels. I know the player I am. They know the player I am. Pay me next year. We'll see if we can figure it out. I wouldn't be surprised if that's how it goes. But for the meantime, at least, we're not going to probably see him for a few weeks. So good chance we might not play him either of the games against the Ravens. Gives us a huge upper hand over them, even though he hasn't played particularly great against us. But I'm still playing Tyler Huntley over Lamar at this point. So I think it's interesting, because we assumed, for good reason, because most teams that start 2-7 or 2-6, like we started, they don't factor into the playoff race at this point in the season or past. But of course, as always, we are figuring out a way to inject ourselves into the conversation, despite maybe it not being the best thing for our future. And it's something we do have to talk about now, because now every game does mean something, because if we are going to win the games, you might as well win all of them and see what you can do. At this point, I don't want to finish, 7-10 at this point. I want to finish 9-8, 10-7, or not win any more games. It's got to be one or the other, in my opinion. So
yeah, that is just worst case scenario. We've talked about this multiple times on the podcast before. I'm like, man, if Steelers claw back to 7 or 8 wins, that just doesn't do much for you. I mean, maybe you get you a little bit of boost of confidence as opposed to being a 3-win team. But other than that, I mean, you're not making the tournament at that point. You want to see an all or nothing here. And so at this point, I mean, the Steelers drafted their quarterback. That was the big thing. We might as well root for them to win out, see what happens. You never know if they end up making the playoffs. You'd take a miracle, I think, to do anything of any significance, but you don't know what can happen. And so we'll see. They've got a very winnable slate down the stretch. I think as long as Pickett keeps trending in that right direction, you never know what can happen. I mean, again, their slate of games to begin the season was the hardest in the NFL. And so that counts for something. And when you're doing that with new players in the offensive line, a quarterback shift, there's a lot of factors that go into that. So Steelers could certainly be a better team by the end of the year. I don't know if they can be one that can compete when it matters the most, but I mean, we'll see what happens here. I mean, no sense rooting for losses at this point with a team that is close enough that they could get into the tournament here. The Steelers opened the week, and actually the Ravens would have been favored in this game had not been for the PCL injury to Lamar Jackson. Other than that, on Monday, that they were 1.5-point favorites at home. Now they're up to 2.5-point favorites, courtesy of FanDuel. And so it's been a while. We're not used to seeing the Steelers favored in games this year, but it's not hard to see why, though, either. The Ravens are just 1-3 with Brett Hundley at quarterback. Very unlikely that Lamar suits up this week. Adam Schefter said that that PCL is typically will keep a quarterback out of action for 1 to 3 weeks. So I would not expect him to come back and play this week, especially with how tough the Steelers always play against Lamar. I do like Pittsburgh's chances in this one, though, with the way that things are shaping out here. And it took an unfortunate blow for the Ravens to make the Steelers pretty comfortable favorites here. Again, it's definitely not a game that's guaranteed, but that one certainly shifts the results over, I think, into their favor a little bit. So let's talk about those injuries real quick. We talked about Lamar. TJ Watt, like we alluded to earlier, I just don't think that he's playing healthy right now. Mike Tomlin kind of said that as well. He's got that rib injury, and maybe, who knows, another week of rest. That'll trend in the right direction as well. And we'll see a Watt that's a little bit more close to full strength. Other than that, we've got Chris Boswell with a groin injury, who is eligible to come off of IR this week. I think Matthew Wright's done serviceable in his stead. He had a good game against the Falcons. He likes hitting that upright, though, doesn't he?
Yeah, it's just, the problem is, like, the results have been fine for the most part, but it just doesn't look good.
No, it's not pretty. It's not.
Feel a little bit like, I don't know if he's going to make this or not. So
it is. You can tell it, man. He's got to put a little more oomph into that too, on the 45 and out range. So I'm excited to get Boswell back here. I'm hoping that he's ready to return. Just because he's eligible off the IR window doesn't necessarily mean that the Steelers will activate him. So that's a storyline that we'll have to keep an eye on throughout the week. And the same goes for William Jackson as well, the cornerback that Steelers traded for just before the deadline. Jackson is also eligible to come off of IR with a back injury. We will see, though, what his practice looks like this week and if he's eligible to come off. All right. Any other injuries, Shane, out there?
With that, I don't think so, but I do think that it's likely we see both Boswell and Jackson out for at least another week, is my guess, just from what I've been hearing, just because Jackson especially needs practice time, honestly. Like, he needs to be able to actually be ready to play, honestly. And then Boswell, they're not going to rush him back if Wright is making his kicks as ugly as they may be. I don't think they're going to risk him being gone for the rest of the season, especially if they are going to try to make a push down the stretch. So.
Yeah, and I will throw out too, Ahkello Witherspoon finally landed on IR with that hamstring injury. So disheartening. I had high hopes for Witherspoon. I thought his last 6 games of the 2020 season or 2021 season were really good. And he didn't play well to begin the year, but it was a small sample size. He was out without any sort of pass rush in those games. And some of those plays that he gave up, I still thought he had good coverage on.
The Aguilar one
Yeah, the Aguilar one, the AJ Brown. I mean, he's swatting at that ball. He's narrowly missing that. So I do think that Witherspoon would have given them better options as a boundary cornerbacks than what they have right now. But the guy has just not stayed healthy. He stood up in weeks 1 through 3, tried to make a comeback in week 8, immediately was out again with that hamstring injury, and now on IR with it. We'll see if that ends his season or not, but it's going to take it pretty close to right up till the end of the season. Unfortunate season for him. All right, Shane, let's talk about the matchups this week against the Ravens. These are always some fun ones to watch against a heated division rival. These are tough, hard-fought games. The first one that I want to point out here is trying to cover Mark Andrews. And we know how the Steelers linebackers have been in coverage this year. We know how they were the past several years. My goodness, a few weeks back, Samaje Perine scored 3 touchdowns against all 3 Steelers linebackers, Devin Bush, Miles Jack, and Robert Spillane. And so when the linebackers are largely responsible for covering running backs and tight ends, I could see a big game forthcoming for Mark Andrews here.
Yeah, for me, as much as I do think that's a very important matchup, I'm hoping, and it's not going to happen because the Steelers never do what I want them to do. But if I'm Steelers, I'm parking Minkah Fitzpatrick right in his grill every single snap, because as much as Lamar has struggled down the field this year because the receivers haven't been good, Huntley is even less of a threat to do that, right? Let your corners see if you can just manhandle their receivers and not allow them down the field. See if you can do that, and just let Minkah just park his butt right wherever Andrews is every play and just make him beat you, right? Because if you can make Andrews beat you and force him to be the only guy that can beat you and still cover the other guys, it's going to be a rough day for Huntley. It just is. Like, he's not going to be able to do much. And even Lamar hasn't done much as a passer recently because they're so depleted in the receiving core. So if you can at least do that much, maybe the linebackers aren't as big of a deal. But I know they're probably going to just put Devin Bush on him or whoever else, and it's just going to be zone coverage in the film. He's going to find it's going to probably be like a 10-catch day for him. It's just hopefully not any touchdowns or anything.
Yeah, I don't want to walk in here all cocky, but you're exactly right. I'm not worried about the Ravens receivers. I'm just
you can't be at this point. You can't.
Devin Duvernay is their best one, and then their rosters. I mean, their positional group is just trash outside of that. And so I don't think the Steelers should be game planning for that. You obviously don't want to take them lightly. Anything can happen. They can get a few big plays, but you got a backup quarterback in there, and you've got a very bottom of the barrel wide receiver corps. You need to take Mark Andrews out of the game somehow, some way. Double cover him, have inside out coverage, whatever you want to do. If you don't want to use Minkah there, if you want Minkah to be more of a roaming playmaker or the guy that just stays more back in the secondary trying to make plays on the football, then use a combination of KZ and Edmonds on him. Do something.
For sure. Whatever.
But please don't have the linebackers on him. I think that Devin Bush's coverage has been better as of late. But I would still not feel comfortable with that matchup, especially with a short, compact linebacker trying to cover one of the best.
I'm okay with him in man occasionally because he has the physical skills to run with him, but his zone feel compared to Andrew's zone feel, it's just not a good matchup. Like, if you're going to run zone, you got to make sure there's somebody that's keeping Andrews in check other than the linebackers, but we'll see how they do it. But I have a feeling it's probably going to be mostly.
You know that they're always going to look his way in the red zone too.
Yeah,
so if Steelers don't try to double him in the red zone, I'm going to pull my hair out. Like, it's going to be that frustrating. So Mark Andrews, I think that's the big one this week for the Steelers. I also want to highlight the Steelers defensive line, who's coming off a pretty rough game against the Atlanta Falcons. They were just bulldozed. I mean, some of those guys had embarrassing games. I went back and watched Montrevious Adams, Tyson Alulu. Those guys were on their backs a lot, and they were getting just blown off the line of scrimmage. And so when you have a mauling run blocking team like the Baltimore Ravens, who can kind of impose their will against defensive lines, this matchup scares me a little bit.
Yeah, it's not super exciting to think about. We know the Ravens have always been an excellent rushing team, for years, even before Lamar got there and made that rushing attack even more diverse. But Huntley can definitely still run. You have to watch out for him. They have to be disciplined, right? Because if you allow Huntley to take the edge on you, or if you let these guys run inside, free-willing, like, it's going to be ugly. You don't want to get into a run game battle with them, because as much as our run game has been great, we're much more susceptible to the run game than they are. We just are. The numbers back that up, especially against the Ravens. I mean, right now they're top 3 in attempts against you, runs that the teams have even done against them, yards allowed and yards per attempt allowed, right? Like, they're just an excellent run team, and you don't want to have to try to challenge them on that front in this game.
Yeah, I know. I'm hoping that things go smooth on the trenches there, because, again, the same can be said about the Steelers running game in Baltimore's defensive line. You kind of flip the script there. Baltimore's defensive line has been excellent. All their guys are grading out very well there. They allow just 3.8 yards per carry. And so, like I said, I think this is going to be the big true test since we've seen the emergence from the Steelers running game. Can they continue against a stout defense that specializes in stopping the run? And so if they're able to do that this week, I'll be very encouraged by that. If they're not, I'll be a little bit worried that what we've been seeing maybe is a little bit fraudulent against some poor opponents. And I don't want that to be the case at all. I do think that there's going to be, there are just going to be plays that look really bad at times. There's going to be guys on the Steelers that are getting just blown over. We just don't want it to happen consistently. And we want to be able to still see running success through that, because even with Huntley leading this team this week and the Ravens not having a great offense, their defense only allows 19.7 points per game. That's 9th best in the NFL. That's really not going to change, I don't think, whether Lamar's there or not. And you're going to put a lot of pressure on Kenny Pickett if you can't run the ball. So I want to see that run success continue this week. And so let's talk about one more matchup here. Kenny Pickett against Baltimore's secondary. This is a secondary that early in the season they struggled. Like they had that abysmal game against the Dolphins early in the year. I don't know if you remember that one or not.
Oh, I do. Yeah.
That was a train wreck. That was an absolute train wreck. Since then, though, and recently, their secondary has kind of been like the Steelers' run game since the bye. It's been really good. Maybe in a better version of that, because they've got talent there. I mean, they got talent out the wazoo. They've got Kyle Hamilton and just Marcus Williams and all these guys in their secondary. And these guys are starting to step up to the plate now and really play well. And so this matchup scares me a little bit. They've got some ball hawks back there that can really make Pickett pay if he's not careful. So, I mean, you got a prediction on maybe how that will play out for Pickett this week?
I think the biggest thing, and like you can look at, obviously early in the season, like you said, their secondary was definitely struggling a little bit. And so far they're, I think 28th in yards or 25th in yards allowed passing, but they're not giving up many yards per attempt. It's really because of how many pass attempts they've seen. So I think 6.9, 6.8 yards per attempt they've allowed. So, and they're taking the ball away a lot too. And you mentioned that, like, avoiding turnovers is the number one thing. I don't mind if we don't throw a ton on this defense because it's not the best way to attack them. I don't mind if we don't throw for a ton of yards or yards per attempt. It's just about, can we move the chains in the passing game? And more importantly, can we just not give them the football? Because they have 24 turnovers, 11 picks, 9 fumbles. Like, they are certainly one of those defenses that kind of rely on turnovers a little bit, especially earlier in the season whenever they're giving up a ton of yards. Now it's more so they are able to lock down, especially Marlon Humphrey's had a great season, and his right is a great corner as well, both inside and out. So if you can find a way to be successful without forcing the issue too bad and putting balls up, to the safeties especially that can take the ball away, that's what I'm looking to see from Pickett.
Yeah, this truly, to me, is a game that will probably be decided based on the turnover battle here, and whoever wins that. I see this one being a low-scoring affair, and we'll see how that plays out. But again, if Pickett can have success throughout a game, and it comes against the Ravens this week, I'll be really impressed, because Baltimore just has a good defense, and so he does need to be cautious this week. I think more so than usual, because that secondary is starting to play well here, and they can really make him pay if he's not careful. And so I think that's something to definitely keep an eye on. How Pickett plays this week. Give me your key to victory this week for the Steelers, Shane. What are they going to have to do to get their third in a row? And by the way, if they are able to get 3 wins in a row, this will be the first time since early in the 2021 season that they were able to do that. So it's been a little while.
I think for me, we talked about already, you have to avoid turnovers, right? You cannot give this team the football because they still are going to have an effective running game. You don't want to have, our offense sit on the bench the whole game, especially in the first half. So you have to avoid turnovers. Again, you have to run the ball efficiently, at least efficiently enough where you can lean on it later in the game, especially if you can get a lead going. And outside of that, you have to force Huntley to beat you with his arm, right? If he has to be able to make plays in the passing game to beat us. If they can force him to have to do that, they don't have the receiving core. And if we play our cards right, Andrews also shouldn't be running wide open, hopefully. So it's just going to be hard to beat us if he has to throw the ball consistently. So force him to do that. I think you're going to have a really good shot at winning the game.
Yep. I think that take the running game away the best that you can. Plan to stop Mark Andrews. I will make anybody else beat you. If Duvernay ends up with 10 catches for 100 yards,
great.
That's fine.
Good for him.
Yes,
good for him.
Exactly. You need to take Mark Andrews out of the game. That's the guy that if they are able to get something go through the passing game, it'll probably be through him. And so if they're able to do those two things, and again, control the turnover battle, that'll be huge this week in a game that could be a very low scoring one. I think that's what the Steelers need to do to come away with a third straight win. So Shane, let's go ahead and give our game predictions for week 14 before we wrap up. How do you see this one playing out?
So I have a 24-20 Steelers win, a little bit more scoring than I know you had in this game. We'll talk about you obviously in a second here, but I think we can get like a 17-10-ish halftime lead. And then it comes down to the defense holding things down and us not getting so conservative like we have been the last couple weeks in the second half, where we can get another touchdown in there to kind of ice things off and then let the defense handle things from there. I think that's the path to victory. I'm hoping that we can at least score that many points, because I think you're going to have to guarantee yourself a good shot at winning.
Yeah, I would have loved to have been able to go like 24, 26 points this week. My problem is when you score 19 points against the Atlanta Falcons and they've got a pretty poor defense, I mean, is Canada going to hold them back again? We've seen, again, these second half offensive performances have been terrible still. Despite the Steelers' success since the bye week, the second half has still been really bad. And so I want to believe that can happen. I'm not sure if it will against a stout team like the Ravens. And so I'm predicting a 19-16 Steelers win. That would be the same score as we just saw last week. That total comes just under the point spread, or the point total for this week. And Shane's is a little bit over. So we've got the same result. We're just difference on the over-under this week. All right. I think that's going to do it for us. Anything else you need to add today, Shane? Did we miss anything?
I do think this is one thing I'm going to predict, and I'm hoping I'm right about this.
Okay.
I want to see it just partially because I want it to stop being something I see occasionally on Twitter. I think Pickett has his first multi-pass touchdown game. I have a feeling he's going to score 2 times through the air, not just on the ground like he has in the past.
I want to see that happen so bad. And I hope that you're right on that. I'm waiting for it. I'm ready for it. Give me like a 2-touchdown, 280-yard game, and I'll be satisfied.
For sure. Yeah.
All right. Thank you today for joining us on the Still Curtain podcast. You can follow Shane on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Still Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also check us out on YouTube. And thanks for listening to the Still Curtain podcast.